Okay, so if I flip forward, I flip forward like that. Okay. All right.
You probably use keyboard arrow.
Okay. So I can start at this point, right? Yeah. Okay, I'll be brief. Yeah. Okay. Can we just check that everyone can hear me? Okay. They can hear me. Okay. Good. Yeah. All right. Let's kick off. All right.
We're just staying near the
absolutely
computer,
because that's where the microphone is, and that's also where the video is.
Yeah.
Okay. So what we know is that the issue of sustainability has been a great concern. I'll be relatively brief coming through this, but there's an enormous volume of literature talking about sustainability in agriculture and food. Almost too much to be able to handle. Plenty of guidance issued to agribusinesses, and I'm using here the 1957 definition from farm to fork, about how they could report sustainability and so forth. On the other hand, when we turn to existing standards and we look at how agribusinesses have reported under those existing standards, what we find by contrast is that there's relatively little reporting information being done and very little discussion about this. And what there is has been almost exclusively focused on developed countries where we have significant quantities reporting. And insofar as developing countries are concerned, there is merely, really, quite frankly, a lot of worry and concern about the fact that existing voluntary disclosures do not go far enough in presenting some of the potential negative impacts of what agribusinesses are doing to the environment and indeed socially as well in terms of their effects. It's interesting to see that the latest article saying something positive actually referred to probably the most unlikely place of all, which was a reporting from Cargill, which demonstrates who's ahead of the game here and who's significantly behind it. It's not surprising that agribusinesses in the world generally have some problems with reporting because there are simply so many different ways that they can report. The big five organisations that got set up as individual consultancies, the CDB and CDSB are framework organisations, and they have published standards which run now beyond climate, but they essentially dig up from other people's standards. GRI is focused on double materiality, so it's looking at the impact on the world, as well as the impact on investors and lenders, providers of capital. So they have that perspective. The International Integrated Reporting Council has been attempting to link together financial and sustainability reporting. And notice here that I'm talking about sustainability, not ESG. Sustainability is now the way that we talk about this in terms of reporting. And finally, you've got the ISSB, which has published some really detailed and interesting standards, but they are designed for investors, they're designed for providers of capital, they are interested in materiality strictly insofar as it relates to impacts on future cash flows. And then you have other organisations that are pitching into this. We have the World Economic Forum, we have the Task Force on Climate Financial Disclosure, we have a number of other organisations that are around this, the Millennium Goals and so forth. Then there's another strand of development, particularly from the European Financial Reporting Advisory Group, EFRAG, which is looking at compulsory, mandatory reporting issues, which we're now going to get to. And it's really interesting to see that whilst Europe is looking at mandatory reporting, we're a long way away from that even in Australia, let alone in developing countries. The US is taking a different tack and sticking very much to single materiality. And we'll see what the impact of this is on US reporting soon. The exchanges all have their own regulation requirements, and the ASX is quite stringent in this regard. The rating agencies have been publishing environmental and sustainability ratings as well. And then finally, you've got the indexes which exist. Now, I'm going to be focusing particularly on what's been happening with respect to the standard setting bodies and the implications for those. But even when we get to the end of that, there's still all the other regulatory players in the market, as it were. Lots of others. It won't take away what the rating agencies do. It won't take away the existence of the indexes. It won't stop the exchanges having their own regulations. And it very definitely will not stop the national and supranational bodies having their own regulations, some of which will become mandatory. So that's where we are, and my apologies for going relatively quickly through this, but I'm conscious of time. So this is an example of an SASB snapshot presentation, and you can see how they look at it. In quite a broad sense, but a narrow sense at the same time. So focused on what investors might care about, but they recognise that, that investors in any given area, and this is taken, I think, from the food and beverage one that SASB has produced, they're interested in focusing on issues to do with the environment. They're concerned about governance within organisations in a relatively traditional way. They're interested in what the business is doing in terms of innovation, particularly, of course, in terms of climate response. And they also have, and this is important in the way that I'm going to progress the discussion, they also have a substantial degree of input in terms of both human capital and social capital. So the SASB standards are much more than just climate disclosure. They're looking at a wide range of issues, including these that are here. I'm doing my best to admit this guest. Right, so what's been happening? Well, if you look at the slides here, you'll see that over recent years, there's been some really quite dramatic developments so far as the unification of the different standard setting bodies are concerned. And what essentially has happened is that the big beast, the IFRS, the International Financial Reporting Standards Authority, has decided to get involved and effectively to become the dominant market force in respect of sustainability reporting. And so, despite all these different standards, what has gradually happened is that, and of course sustainability reporting under each of these standards has been really quite different. What has happened is that 2 years ago, the IFRS Foundation began to reel them all in and then knit them together to found one organisation. And up to a point, they've been successful. In 2021, in October, the IFRS Constitution was amended, creating a new institution, which is going to become extremely important for all of us, the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board. And that is charged with the provision of high quality, transparent and comparable sustainability disclosure standards intended to be useful to investors and other participants in the world's capital markets in making their economic decisions. That's what that is about. Accountants, KPMG, E&Y, others have described this as a historic step, the most significant development in ESG reporting for some time, to say the very least, and a major step towards the convergence of the existing fragmented reporting landscape. And institutionally and organisationally, that has absolutely been the case. The CDSB has consolidated in the Value Reporting Foundation, which was itself formed as a result of the merger of the SASB and the IIRC, is intended to fold up in about June. And the SASB standards have become the basis for the ISSB standards. And TCFD is also involved, and there is a strong technical readiness working group inside the IFRS, which is supporting the ISSB with members from all of these organisations, the great and the good, effectively, of international disclosure standards. So quite a lot going on, but you will notice that from my previous slide, you'll see that one major organisation, the GRI, is missing in action. They're not part of the ISSB, and we'll have cause to question the reasons behind that a little bit later on. What has now happened is that the ISSB has produced a series of prototype standards, and they produced one on climate, and they produced one on general. And the two standards, although they are initially identified as prototypes, they've already been said that they provide stakeholders and market participants with a pretty good idea on how to report on sustainability-related risks and opportunities, and that comes from Ernst & Young. Judging from those prototypes, there are some pretty substantial differences from the European Union approach, which is very much aligned with the GRI approach. The first difference is conceptual. The double materiality approach has gone, essentially. So when we report sustainability, we're interested in this from an essentially capital provider's perspective. The concept of dynamic materiality as well, the idea of what happens in future might conceivably have an impact on your cash flows, has also been rejected. So we're looking at this from a more strictly accountancy perspective. So what happens now is the relevant consideration. Too broad a consideration to look at future impacts in this regard. So the kinds of examples that the prototype has been taking up, things like changes within the supply chain and the impact of a carbon emissions tax, for example, they're both illustrations of the need for reporting under ISSB to be very closely connected with discernible, distinct, and identifiably differentiated financial outcomes. That's what this is actually about. This reverses the original motivation behind ESG standards, the kind of thing that excited me about ESG standards, which is that we would be judging businesses and firms on separate set of criteria than their ability to generate cash flows for their investors. That difference in concept is a major, major difference in the way that we're going. What's happened essentially is that SASB and the influence that it's had has ended up being the dominant theme behind the ISSB. The second difference is one of scope, and it flows from the first. So, for example, the ISSB prototype talks about climate, labour practices, human rights, community relations, water and diversity, water and biodiversity, I should say, are the issues which are the most significant sustainability concerns for investors and other providers of capital. Prima facie, perfectly reasonable, but who is to say whether these are the dominant considerations for capital? Nobody has said. There's no explanation in the standards as to why that should be the case, nor any methodology as to how the ISSB is going to go about deciding what will affect enterprise value in the future. In fact, it's been specifically devolved upon individual entities. Inevitably, when you try and coalesce a group under any circumstances, there's a certain risk of lowest common denominator, right? And that's where we're headed here. Some issues are going to be easier to resolve than others, and that follows the issues that the ISSB is finding easier to resolve. It is clear that the relative level of difficulty associated with developing climate compared with governance, and especially social standards, can be judged by the fact that the CDSB, SASB, and TCFD started to work together on climate standards as early as 2017. But when it comes to social standards, the CDSB has only just got round to publishing them, and the TCFD doesn't produce any, whilst the SASB standards have remained unintegrated with GRI, and indeed with those of the IRC until they merged. The social disclosure example provided within the prototype general standard, child labour, is probably one on which there is universal agreement across different cultures and different organisations. But it's quite noteworthy that there was no discussion of gender equality, for example, in the social standards. And as for other issues, they are completely absent. Theoretically, it seems to me, and in the absence of their inclusion in the ISSB standards, diametrically opposite cultural perspectives on the part of investors could actually result in entities reporting mirror images of their risks, material risks to enterprise value, which is a baffling circumstance, but one that is quite possible to do. The third difference is one of extent and boundary. There are different potential dimensions along which standards can be pursued by theme or by industry, and the ISSB is going to pursue these concurrently. It's not clear how this will interact with respect to agribusiness sustainability reporting any more than anywhere else. The climate prototype does foresee specific industry climate metrics that are going to be produced, and the technical protocol supplement to the climate prototype has adopted the SASB division of the industry, agricultural products, and then alcoholic beverages, food retailers and distributors, non-alcoholic beverages, and so forth. The ISSB has left the opportunity open for additional information to be published and included. For example, differences in your reporting, in your strategy or your business model in relation to sustainability risks. But these, once again, all are going to lie at the foot of the individual reporting entity. And finally, the most important, perhaps, difference is in reporting format. The IFRS has already established that the principles of integrated reporting that the IARC has promoted will be used to link IFRS financial statements with ISSB sustainability standards, essentially rendering the possibility very real that the ISSB standards will be open to the same charges of regulatory capture, which have been identified in the literature on a number of occasions, which have been to which the IARC framework has also been made subject over the past few years. In addition to that, the prototype standard on climate calls for narrative disclosure of issues like board skills and competencies to govern and manage strategies surrounding climate risks and opportunities. It also suggests specific disclosure on issues such as greenhouse gas emissions, the current internal carbon price used that entity uses, or the range of prices used for assessing climate risks and making investment strategy decisions. But none of these will be necessarily compulsory. So quite a lot of impact. Discussion has already been around on the regulatory capture of the IARC. I don't think it's going to be very long before we get discussion about regulatory capture of the ISSB as well. Questions of scope then there. I'll skip through these relatively quickly because they cover this in more depth. So those are the environmental, social and governance issues that, that are being raised. But that comes from ISSB. But what we see here in depth, these are, and I'm sorry if these slides are a little difficult to see, but hopefully you can see them okay. So there are some my point here is really this. There are some metrics which are clearly carried over from the SASB directly into the ISSB. And they are, I hate to say the easy ones, because of course it's not that easy to capture these inside any organization. But they are ones where there is more unanimity of agreement cross-culturally. That's the point. So issues, as you can see up here, issues about greenhouse gas emissions, which are quantitative. Anything which is quantitative here is easier to do. Energy management questions, water management questions, and ingredient sourcing. Those are core SASB standards which are being carried across unchanged. And when I check the documents, they are unchanged straight across. So the world will be following what the SASB has set out in this regard. In addition to that, the activity metrics, so production by crop, number of processing facilities, total land under active production, and cost of agricultural products sourced externally, that's carried across directly as well. However, there are missing pieces from the SASB standards that have not been carried across. Food safety is not there yet. It may get included in some general standard, but you would have thought that it would be included in the general standard section already. We have to hope that that turns up in the food and beverage and related issues that are put into the general standards going forward, though it clearly has some climate impact as well. Workforce health and safety is not there yet, but it's surely inconceivable that the ISSB general standards won't include those. They certainly need to be in there. Nothing there on the ingredient supply chain either yet, on the environmental and social impacts of that. So sourcing, but not the social impacts of the supply chain. So things like the percentage of agricultural products sourced that are certified to third-party agricultural standards, environmental standards and social standards and so on, and non-conformity rates in terms of social and environmental responsibility audits by recognised international auditors and so forth. All of those are the kinds of considerations. Developments of strategies to manage environmental and social risks from contract growing, for example, and commodity sourcing. These were all in the SASB standards, but they haven't made it through the cut yet. And finally, GMO management, and that might actually be sufficiently contentious that quite possibly that really never makes it to the cut. We'll have to see. I've been looking at some of the issues that might be added from the other standards that are not there. And because those standards will not be in existence anymore, CDSB is not publishing anything anymore, CDP links into the other standards anyway, the only possible sort of source of potential missing pieces, which will continue to be out there, is GRI. So GRI does in many cases do a bit more than what SASB does. And so, for example, things that we might have wanted to see there, such as disclosure of energy intensity, the use of renewable energy sources, reductions in energy requirements of products and services sold in reporting periods, That could come from GRI, but it's not there. Biodiversity reporting, natural ecosystem conversion, soil health, pesticide use, animal health and welfare, not there yet. And then potential social reporting, and this is where it gets really tricky. So GRI asks for reporting on issues not only on health and safety, but also your active position taken on labour relations, including freedom of association, a living wage, and collective bargaining. And of course, people like me will be very keen on that. Reporting on land and resource rights. So if you want to practice in the European Union and you want to sell into the European Union, you're going to have to take a position on that very soon, because the GRI in the European Union mandatory reporting will ask you to do so. But if you want to operate in other jurisdictions, you won't have to. Reporting on land and resource rights, including the right of indigenous peoples, non-discrimination and equal opportunity, and a strong position against child labour and forced labour. Measures taken against corruption and anti-competitive behaviour, and a position on public policy and lobbying. Now, that's not going to be very popular, I think, in certain quarters as well. TCFD as well published a number of disclosure metrics for agriculture and its implementation proposals, 2017, which have been updated in 2021. Interestingly, the original proposals contained illustrative metrics, examples of disclosure metrics for agriculture, food and forest products, but they've now been dropped quietly because other standards have picked those up, i.e. the ISSB standards have picked those up. But Scope 2 and Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions, subject to a materiality assessment for Scope 1 and 2, and for Scope 3, and a general requirement for Scope 1, that's something that TCFD would certainly add. And the results of climate change related scenarios in terms of entity resilience, and the risks of opportunities that climate change generate in terms of the ability to generate revenues. Those seem like very valuable potential concepts that could be taken across from TCFD, but they're not the only ones. There's revenues and savings from low carbon investments and the distinction between mechanical and non-mechanical emissions, and governance arrangements. That's perhaps a very important one, the disclosure of governance arrangements surrounding these questions as well. And EFRAG, which has also produced a climate standard prototype, substantially based on CCFD, but of course mandatory. But there are some additional reporting aspects there, internal carbon pricing systems and incentives for compensation within the organisation around climate targets, very EU focused of course, and the proportion of product mix aligned towards climate-based opportunities. All those emissions that I've listed here have an opportunity potentially to be both material, in terms of their impact on investors and stakeholders, and of significance to the rest of the outside world. And we might be interested to see, at the very, very least, the extent to which in future the ISSB, with its dialogue with the European Union and the development of the mandatory standards that are being produced there, essentially revolving around TCFD but GRI influenced, actually lead to some further considerations there. So the conclusions that I can draw are pretty much set up here. It's been voluntary before. You can call IFRS voluntary, but if you want to play in the global market, it's not so really very voluntary. So we're moving towards mandatory standards. And I can well remember when the idea of mandatory ESG standards was first raised, and the degree of opposition that was raised about and so forth, which has now gradually evaporated. We will start to move towards much more uniform reporting, and that has to be a very good thing. Campbell's Soups has been reporting, bless them, under 7 different standards, and think of the bureaucratic work involved in all of that. That will come down to just 1. So it's going, and it'll maybe 2, a 2-stream approach. Mandatory in the jurisdictions in which you need to operate. IFRS, if you wish to report under IFRS standards, you have to report ISSB as well. Now, what SASB have said in relation to this, they say it's not about achieving global standardization. It's about, as they say, it's about giving the opportunity to allow for some jurisdictional differences in implementation. Now, I suspect that that may actually be, to some extent, an emollient statement about what the purpose of all this is. My own view is that it is likely to lead to standardization. That is a good thing. But as you can see from my presentation, there are a number of omissions that one might be concerned about. For agribusinesses, I think these are my conclusions. Many more will start to report around the world. we'll start to get a fertile ground for research into reporting by agribusinesses, and we'll be able to make comparisons between what happens in Serbia and what happens in the United States and what happens in Ghana in a way that we've not been able to do in the past. Obviously, it will depend on the accuracy of reported data, but that is improving all the time. Quantitative reporting will be largely environmental. There'll be much more agreement about that than there will be about anything to do with social standards. It'll run off the SASB standards, and we'll see the new standards coming out from the ISSB relatively quickly because the raw material is there for them to do so. Social and governance reporting will be integrated into the IFRS stuff, and it will end up being rather narrative in the way that it does and devolve down on the individual entities. And we may be seeing the end soon to separate ESG reporting. It will all be tied together, and so your annual report will look rather different from the annual reports that we've been used to seeing in the past, almost exclusively focused on the financial issues. They will be much broader. They will touch on sustainability issues. I think this is a very exciting series of developments. It has a lot of potential, but there are a lot of risks for slippage along the way. But that's my summary of where we are at the moment. Thanks very much for listening to. Very much appreciated. If anyone's got any questions, if we've got time, then I'm more than happy to take them in what time remains to us.
Okay, there's also online. If you want to ask or type your questions on the chat line, you can do that.
I can hear it, but I can't hear it through this.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, you can do that. How do I? It's very, very quiet. It doesn't work. Not least in the room too.
Okay, can we have someone speak? Ram, are you able to say something so that we can see if it's working?
Sorry, I was on mute. Can you hear me, please?
Yep. That's
okay.
better.
Okay, so if you have questions, please ask.
Yeah. So I can certainly see how this applies for large companies like, as you described, Campbell or Argo.
Mm-hmm.
How do you see this applying for smaller businesses?
Mm-hmm.
Do you see there being like a threshold under which they wouldn't have to report?
Yeah, well, it's yeah.
Is this all voluntary?
Right. So the answer to that, I think, is that if you want to report under IFRS, so that's a self-imposed standard limitation, then you will be obliged to follow the ISSB standard. So that's a sort of automatic issue. You don't report under IFRS unless you want to be a public company or you want to attract external investment or whatever the reasons that you might have for following.
You can use it for marketing purposes.
Right, all of that. So I think those companies that already report under IFRS will be reporting under this, and there may be some who will be inclined to report under IFRS because they can report under ISSB, but I don't suspect there'll be too many of those. Mandatory reporting, it's not clear yet as to what the threshold for reporting under the European Union's rules are, and they will be different across every individual jurisdiction depending on size. So we're some considerable away from every small agribusiness being obliged to report in its accounts to the National Accounting Organization as to what they are going to do. That's the ultimate goal, of course, of sustainability reporting. That's what the founder of SASB wanted to create. And we're on that track, because even the smallest of businesses has to report to the tax authorities. So there's no reason for them not to report under this, but there is no question that is a long, long way away. Okay. Not even on the radar yet. It is larger entities we're talking about.
Thank you. Jeff?
So the issue of materiality.
Sorry, was somebody going to raise a question? Sorry. Somebody going to raise a question online here?
I haven't heard.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
The issue of materiality to the global interests, not just the financial interests of the firms. So it's obviously, I mean, you could view it as sort of slippage, a backward step, the way you describe it. Do you think that that's Is that a sort of a trend that it will continue, or do you think there's a possibility of turning it around and reintroducing broader considerations?
The latter, but for two different reasons. The SEC is quite isolated on this now. The SEC have been quite clear that they're not. They don't want,
the SEC?
Sorry, the Securities and Exchange Commission of the United States. So the equivalent of our regulator. They've been quite isolated on this, and they're coming for quite a bit of stick for not going on with this. The European Union has definitely taken a firm position to say that double materiality is the way that they want to go. All the organisations reporting under the GRI, and there are many thousands of them, do that anyway. And the UN is behind that initiative. So the pressure on the mandatory side is going to be for double materiality reporting. The ISSB reporting, not so. And in fact, if you want to be optimistic about it, that's a great combination. So you report to the government in the broadest sense of the word, because those are stakeholders who are interested in the broad sense of the issue, and you report to your shareholders and to your lenders and others under ISSB because that's what they're legitimately interested in. And then you have no problem of fiduciary duty, because that's always been an issue in this question. If you take a position of double materiality and you act on it, then potentially you have an a question of fiduciary responsibility. And in the Nordic countries, of course, what they've done is amended the concept of fiduciary responsibility to ensure that it is impossible for anyone to fall into that trap. But it's still an issue, a live issue elsewhere. And right now, there are Republican lawmakers in the United States who are activating to try to pass legislation to stop double materiality as being in breach of fiduciary duty. So it's an intensely political issue. No less for major agribusinesses than any other organisation because of the implications. So you can be optimistic about it, and I think generally, on balance, probably yes. But I think that's the way it's going to go.
In the 80s, there was this big idea of the national accounts. It became something that we need to do, and people were talking about, okay, if we couldn't just put dollar values, we could just have them as extra tiers in the national accounts. I don't think that has happened either.
Oh, it's happening now. It's huge. It's active right now.
That's happening.
Yes, there's a massive resurgence of effort in that area. Yeah.
But is it becoming part of the national accounts?
Or there's a lot of draft accounts being created.
Yeah.
That could become part of the national.
Okay. So I had a bit of interest in indicators in a different context. But the first thing that comes to mind is, okay, if you have so many things, okay, what's the value of the indicators? Because if you have too many things, then it's difficult to see what the information is. And they seem to be going for everything, right? Okay. And you also have the two groups forming at least. Then what happens? This becomes like the university ranking, where you choose whatever you like, right?
Okay. First of all, in answer to your point about it's a very interesting discussion. But I think it is inevitable that in a market, different investors will have different perceptions of value, and they will have different perceptions of what drives that value. So if we are talking about large agribusinesses, generally, the investors in them are relatively sophisticated investors. The people who stand behind them, but the investors themselves are relatively sophisticated. They can use, and they do use, the SASB standards and the numerous disclosures under climate and so on, based on their own scenario, their own view about global warming, about the relative impact of different technologies and all sorts of other issues. They can form a view informed by these numerous different indicators and fed through their decision-making process as to what they think the material impact of climate change or other sustainability issues are on that business. So I think they would say, the investors would say, and I'm working with some at the moment, the more the merrier. We would love to have that as a private equity house or as a sovereign wealth fund or anybody else to be able to look at. Whether they do that, whether they actually walk the walk on that, is another matter altogether. But in principle, the more tools that are available to them, I think they would say, the better that they can. And then mutus mutandis, the same argument applies to government and the existence of different arguments there, and the development of stakeholder logic with respect to companies too. That would be my response, I think. You're picking and choosing. It's a sweet shop of different possibilities. You don't have to do them all.
Okay, I don't see any questions online, so it's getting close to 12, and some people are teaching. I do. So we will stop here, unless there is one last thing you want to say, any of you. I will give you special preference for walking all the way.
Thank you very much.
Discount. Okay, so we will stop here. We'll stop here, and thank you, Dr.
My pleasure.
Julian Roche,
thank you very much indeed.
Offering to be the first for the semester.
Oh, thank you.
Next week we have, I think, a presentation by Ross. Okay, so we will see you next week, and hopefully without glitches. Okay.
Thanks very much, everyone.